Let's continue. Excuse me. We'll read verse 65. We have great status, yet our qualities are less than a spirit's. We are great lamas, yet our attachment and hatred are rougher than Mara's. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self and the executioner, Maraya. So, again, this similar type of idea of being in some sort of position where there's hypocrisy, where there's, we're not really living up to what that is about. We might have some sort of great status due to, the karma that's been generated, and we're in that position, but our qualities are less than a spirit's, meaning that they're just insufficient. They're not really in line with that. And hopefully none of us call ourselves lamas in the room. I don't know. Maybe you are a lama. We are great lamas, or teachers, guides, what have you. Yet our attachment and hatred are rougher than Mara's. But even if we aren't in the position of being considered, to have great status or to be a great lama or whatever reputation we have in the world, however others are looking at us, are we consistent with that view? Are others looking at us as better than we are, and are we giving fuel to that through our own self-cherishing? So it says our attachment and hatred are rougher than Mara's. Remember yesterday I went through the 4 Maras. The 4th one was the Devaputra, the son of the gods. This Mara that is said to be an actual being, that is an interfering force for us, whereas the other Maras are really interferers within our own minds, our own experience. So the Mara in this context, Geshe-la says, should be taken to be this Devaputra Mara. While he himself is a pouch of afflictions, it is said that our attachment, hatred, delusion, and so forth are stronger and rougher than his in this line. So if we have these kinds of greater delusions than even this Mara, there'd be no point in kind of pretending to be some sort of great lama or great teacher. Let's go on to the next one, which is on the quiz. Our view is lofty, yet our behavior is worse than a dog's. The basis of all our good qualities has been lost in the wind. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So if we this view is lofty, this idea is kind of pretending to have some sort of lofty or great realizations. And in the space of that, Geshe-la said, this is kind of interesting, he says, nowadays there are many exalted people who are boastful of their views and who explain that the non-existent is the not existent, empty is empty, and so forth. Where you kind of put on airs of having some great knowledge through your views of reality or something that are not really that great. But from the perspective of their behavior, they are worse than dogs and pigs, in that having scorned all pledges and vows, actions and results and so forth, they rely on drink, alcohol, companions, all of this. So by the force of their behavior, the basis of good qualities is sent away on the wind, in that they lack even one type of morality. And incidental to that, all the happiness and pleasure of this and future lives is also lost in the wind, kind of cast away by virtue of this not engaging in good behavior. So it is one thing to have, a correct view of things and to be able to articulate and know in one's mind what is the proper perspective according to the Buddha's teachings, but it's another to live by those ideals. So we should always make sure our behavior is in line with these views. Kind of our fundamental morality, that will lead to good rebirths, will lead to, good results on the path, that we always uphold that as well as the view. So the next one, the first line, just pointing these out again as we go through, those of you who might want to look at the quizzes. The first line is part of the quiz for this 9th session. We keep all our desires in our innermost heart. We senselessly blame all altercations on others, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So this is kind of a little confusing the way this is worded. We keep all our desires in our innermost heart. It doesn't sound like such a bad thing, does it? But we're talking about desire here that's a desire for our own welfare. It's kind of once more these 8 worldly concerns. It's preoccupied with our wealth, our status, our comfort, all the things that we get preoccupied with. So this is, if this is our innermost heart, is that we're coming from that place in our behavior and all the things that we do, then we're really not practicing pure dharma. We're really not following this path. Our innermost dharma should be the completely pure dharma. Innermost heart should be the completely pure dharma. Where we engage in these types of behaviors that are taught in mind training, such as giving all profit and victory to others, taking all loss and defeat upon ourselves, always wanting to not hold on to those things that are the objects of our attachment. But opposite to that, as this is indicated in this verse, we think, may all desired profit, victory, and the like arise from me, and we keep that in our innermost heart instead of the precious dharma. And then we senselessly blame all altercations on others, all the times that we are quarreling and in conflict with others in our lives, that we blame all of that on others. We don't take the responsibility ourselves, because we are complicit in creating that, as we saw in so many of the verses where we looked at the idea of karma. So it's senseless to blame all of our altercations on others. We're playing a role in that. This is the mind of self-cherishing that blames, that thinks others are at fault and we're completely innocent. So Geshe-la says, it is only the afflictions and never other people who create our problems. And it's not to say that they're doing what they're doing, but there are problems. They're something we created. So we are the creators of that. Others are simply the instrument through which we're experiencing the ripening of that karma. Let's go on to verse 68. Having dressed in saffron, we entreat spirits for protection and refuge. Having taken vows, our trainings comply with Mara. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So, this is speaking here with being dressed in saffron to those who are holding ordination, who are monks or nuns. But nonetheless, any of us who have a commitment to the Dharma, if we kind of make that commitment through an external, holding the vows and living the life of a monastic, but even if we are just, again, those who profess through refuge to, be Buddhist, but then if instead of taking our real refuge, our safe direction in the Dharma, we instead go to worldly things for our refuge. We entreat spirits, as it says here, for protection and refuge. Again, a lot of this comes out of these more kind of traditions that were in Tibet and so on, these types of ideas, or India even, because this text was written by Dharmarakshita in India. But anything that we do in our daily life where we are really taking refuge elsewhere, we take refuge in a lot of things, refuge in entertainment, or refuge in, food and alcohol, some of us, substances that people put a lot of their confidence in, but anything that we go to for protection and refuge that's not the Dharma isn't really a reliable refuge. Now, again, we rely upon a lot of things in our life that are not ultimate refuge. We still do rely on food and many things that we need to sustain this life, but we can't put our absolute confidence in them. We can't put our faith in them. We can't rely upon them in that way. We have to place our trust in the three jewels. And then the second line, having taken vows once more, whether it's pratimoksha, bodhisattva, tantric vows, if in the midst of that we still are simply complying with Mara, doing things that are more in line with the afflictions, this once more is attributable to our own self-cherishing, our own self-grasping, because we aren't really changing our minds on the basis of the vows that we've taken. So, again, these I think are pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Let's go on to the next one, the first line of which is on the quiz. Having been given happiness and pleasure by the deities, we make offerings to evil spirits. Having practiced the guiding Dharma, we deceive the jewels. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So in relation to that first line, Geshe-la says, to have been given the happiness and pleasures of this and future lives by the deities is to have practiced the teachings of the deity of deities, the Muni, the Buddha Bhagawan. So we're really talking about the Buddha here. We're not talking about some other kind of mundane deities. We're talking about those enlightened beings that have given us happiness and pleasure by virtue of giving us the dharma, given us the means to accomplish that. So while they are the sole source of all of our benefit and all that we receive that is good, we make offerings to evil spirits in the place of that. We don't put our, the gratitude that we have doesn't go in the right place. We don't actually acknowledge by making offerings to the three jewels what they have done for us. Rather, we make offerings and go for refuge to mundane gods. The second line, having practiced the guiding dharma, means that we don't have the confidence in the three jewels. We don't have the confidence in the dharma, the medicine itself that the Buddha is advising that we take. So therefore, we might give airs of having taken refuge, but we don't practice accordingly. We deceive the three jewels by engaging in negative actions, not engaging in the skillful actions in accord with karma or any of the other teachings, but primarily the one of karma. Again, karma is such an essential teaching. That's why Dharma-Rakshita spent so much time looking at it in the first part of this. But that is the bottom line of whether we are practicing Dharma or not. Are you paying attention to the law of cause and effect? Are you really living your life day in and day out, trying to avoid the causes of suffering and create the causes of happiness? Which is essentially caught up in not harming others and doing what we can to avoid any difficulties that we create for others. So, let's go forward then to the next verse. Again, if anyone has a question at some point, do let me know, but I will stop occasionally just to see if, check in, but I'm trying to keep questions, if we can, at a bit of a minimum, so we can make sure we at least get through a good part of this text this morning. Having always stayed in isolated places, we are carried away by distraction. Having requested teachings on the holy Dharma and the sciences, we support divinations and Bon. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So it's kind of interesting, I was just mentioning how this is a text written in the Indian Buddhist tradition by Dharma-Rakshita, but we have Bon in there, and Bon is a more kind of the original spiritual tradition that was in Tibet that was supplanted by Buddhism and actually even converted by Buddhism. I think I've heard that His Holiness the Dalai Lama now considers Bon to be kind of the fifth school of Tibetan Buddhism, because you really can't hear much difference when you hear a Bon teacher and a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. I mean, there's no real... It's been influenced so greatly by Buddhism that there's not much of the original Bon tradition left. But it's not meant to be, I think, just an absolute that this is Bon. Perhaps, again, when the Sanskrit was translated into the Tibetan, they used Bon to refer to whatever kind of more animistic or other or aboriginal traditions were there in India that the Dharma-Rakshita was advising people not to support, to kind of put your support where you've received the benefit. So the first line there, having always stayed in isolated places, we're carried away by distraction. So, isolated places doesn't necessarily just mean when we are, kind of in a hermitage or a monastery or someplace where we're isolated. It could even be where we are simply trying to mentally isolate ourselves from others, but we're nonetheless carried away by both physical and mental distraction. We're kind of going along with those distractions, not really putting our efforts into what we're trying to accomplish, whether it be in our daily life or in a retreat setting like I mentioned. So that second line where we had Bon mentioned, it says, having requested teachings on the holy Dharma and the sciences, we support divinations and Bon. So it's like if we're going to, request teachings and try to further our Dharma understanding, well then once more we support and follow the guidance of what we are learning. We don't, rely upon divinations and other traditions and things that they might, that might deceive us. Geshe-la says, having listened to the scriptural systems and so on, without putting effort into practicing their meaning, in order to trick others, we strive in divinations and so forth, put effort only into bon. In brief, village rites, illustrated by ransom rites, exorcism rites, and the like. So if we're really putting our faith in the Dharma, then we don't rely upon those other things. We aren't, going to them as like the be-all and end-all of our decisions and what have you. They often say this. If we look in the West, there's a lot of reliance upon a variety of things, that we shouldn't necessarily go to. If we have the Dharma as our companion, then the Dharma is what we put our confidence in. So I think this is just a very similar verse to a lot of what we've seen. Let's go to the next one, 71. Having rejected morality and liberation, we grasp to a home. Having poured our happiness and pleasure into water, we chase after suffering. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So Geshe-la says, if we guard the cause, completely pure morality, we will attain the result, liberation or even Buddhahood, non-abiding nirvana. Otherwise, having rejected both this cause and its result, we end up grasping to a home. Grasping to a home is kind of an analogy here for the way in which we cling to our ordinary life and the things that are involved in it. Geshe-la in his commentary talks about it being it's suitable to be both a great home and a small home. And he says, as explained before, but I've read this through many times and I never saw where he explained this. He does say what a great home is. He says a great home implies that originally we practiced the Dharma and even took the vows of a monk or nun, but unable to guard the trainings, and having lost them out of attachment, we returned home to a lay life. But I guess the small home is the one that all of us lay practitioners are already involved in, which is our clinging to our day in, day out kind of existence, putting all of our effort there into worldly life, attention to relationships, to work matters, to all of the mundane concerns. So if this is what we're grasping to, clinging to our household, tending to things only within that very limited scope, this is also something that we're doing out of our self-cherishing. So we've turned away from the morality that leads to liberation and enlightenment, and we simply grasp to worldly concerns. Having poured our happiness and pleasure into water, this is kind of a strange concept, but the idea is sort of the idea we saw earlier, kind of casting to the wind, just letting it drain away, not doing anything, good with that, but rather just wasting it, rather just frittering it away. And we end up sort of chasing after suffering, which once more we've seen previously that this is our tendency, that we just continue to create more of the causes of suffering, and our happiness, becomes utterly non-existent because we've wasted it, we've just let it go. Although we wish for that which is desirable and happiness, Geshe-la says, all we do is that we chase after it in a way that abundantly procures only suffering and pours all the happiness and pleasure of this and future lives into water, in the sense that they become utterly non-existent. So we just sort of, again, lose whatever potential we have to actually do something meaningful with this life. Let's go on to verse 72. Having rejected the crossing to liberation, we roam about in remote places. Having obtained a precious human body, we accomplish the hells. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So very similar theme here. We've rejected the crossing to liberation. This is again due to whatever self-cherishing we have. We've been exposed to these teachings, but we reject it. We don't, actually practice the path to attaining liberation. And instead, we roam about in remote places, the wilderness, wander, from here to there. And then having obtained this pleasure, this precious human rebirth, which, as most of you know who've studied Lam Rim, is an incredible sort of vessel for attaining great things. This life that we have as a human being, with the human intellect, with the leisure that a human life affords, at least for most human beings. To use it only to accomplish the hells would be a complete waste. to only engage in behavior that leads to creating more negative karma, to accumulate all of that instead of accumulating all the causes that would lead to liberation or enlightenment. So again, I think that one's fairly clear. Yes, Alison.
Just remote places.
Remote places, just like spending our time wandering here and there. I mean, I think we can say remote places isn't just physical, though. That's what Geshe-la talks about, is kind of these distant places, distant areas. But I mean, distant to what? Distant physically to places where we would kind of maybe be able to attain liberation, or at least work on it. But I think we can talk about places in our own mind. You know, are we distant to the Dharma? Are we wandering to all those worldly concerns again, rather than putting our attention on the Dharma? So distant or remote places, my little note on here says both physically and mentally. We can talk about those. Geshe-la's commentary just says distant areas. That I don't know. All right, let's continue on, carry on. This one, the first line is on the quiz. Having set aside the transformative attributes of the Dharma, we make a profit. Having left behind our Lama's Dharma classes, we wander about the cities and countryside, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So the transformative attributes of the Dharma, Geshe-la says, means that our mind is transformed in dependence on practicing the holy Dharma. You know, this is what the Dharma exists for, is to transform our minds into the state of nirvana, as well as beyond that, to the non-abiding nirvana of Buddhahood. So we set aside those transformative qualities, attributes, and don't develop these realizations in our path. And instead, we put all of our attention into making a profit, to doing something really, what seems more useful from a worldly perspective, having our businesses be successful in all of this. Now again, every one of us has some means of livelihood, no doubt, that we're engaged in. It's not to say that we don't put any attention into that, but it shouldn't be our main goal in this life. Having a fat bank account by the time you die isn't the kind of goal of living, of using this life well. Instead, we want to actually transform our minds. So as I've been pointing out, we can do that mind transformation in many different ways. It can be a 24/7 practice if we have the strength to accomplish that. So even while we're going about our work, while we're making a profit, while we're putting effort into business, we can do it with Dharma intention. We can do it with bodhicitta. And we can certainly use the resources we gain from our work for Dharma purposes. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good. Bodhisattvas need resources. That's why the first perfection is the perfection of generosity, is because you want to make sure that you are born into a life where you have adequate resources to use them for the welfare of others. So this is simply where we've become totally preoccupied with making a profit, with our business, with our work, and we've left aside the ability for the Dharma to really work in our minds. Having left behind our Lama's Dharma classes, we wander about the cities and countryside. Again, cities and countryside, I think, is meant to be, just as with distant areas, or remote places, it's meant to be metaphorical for not just physically what we do, but mentally what do we do. But nonetheless, anytime that, this is ideal if you're living in a place where you do have teachers regularly giving Dharma classes. It's so important to take advantage of that, to always be listening to as much Dharma as we have, even if we've heard something before, even if we feel like, oh yeah, I heard somebody teach on that before, I don't need to go again. Well, you do need to go again. I mentioned this the other day, right? The role of a Dharma teacher is to say the same thing over and over again. The role of a Dharma student is to hear the same thing over and over again. We all just keep doing it until we get it, So until you have it, we should put our effort into attending teachings and not put our effort into wandering around either mentally or physically. Have to really, examine where we're putting our priorities. Let's go on to the next one. Having forsaken our own means of livelihood, we appropriate community property. Having given up earning our own food, we steal it from others. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So again, if we've been unable to earn our own necessities, kind of take care of ourselves, our own means of support, and then in the space of that gone on to appropriate, specifically Geshe-la says, community property from the mouths of the Sangha, which again, as I mentioned, is a very sort of grave fault, because we are keeping people, interfering with their practice, particularly those who have taken vows of ordination, whose main purpose in life is to be dedicated to achieving realizations, to practicing the path, to being of service, and so on. So this is really not something we would want to ever do. Be very careful around community property, particularly with centers where Sangha is more loosely interpreted, but nonetheless, is an important thing to pay attention to. But certainly, if we're in any kind of area where there are ordained people, to be very careful about, taking anything from the resources that that ordained community possesses. Next one. Oh, our fortitude in meditation is little, but our clairvoyance is sharp. Not having begun the path, our feet senselessly race about, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So we have a bit of that tongue-in-cheek in the first line as well, right? Where we have to acknowledge, and through this lack of meditation practice, which is essential to achieving clairvoyances and these other abilities. They say that if you do attain very deep concentration beyond calm abiding to the levels of what are called any of the four jhanas, the four concentrations, you achieve the support for having clairvoyance and other abilities. And so if you don't have the practice to support it, but you boast that your clairvoyance is so sharp, or I can tell you what will happen, or I will be, let me guide you, or whatever. I mean, it would be ridiculous, because you haven't created the causes, and somehow you're trying to pretend to have qualities you don't possess. And then, of course, not having begun the path, not even having set foot on the path, nonetheless, we kind of race about, give this idea that we have attained some great realizations. Geshe-la, in talking about this, his commentary is on that second line. In addition, if we run about, although it is necessary to go to the Buddha ground, we will not begin the path to it, even in the slightest. Instead, senselessly, our feet, which are able to reach everywhere, including India, China, and so on, speedily race about. I mean, I think we can say, that any time that we get preoccupied with things and just waste this life, senselessly race about, senselessly do all these things, and it keeps us from even beginning the path. It keeps us from getting really serious about our practice. So, Tibetan Chodron says that this relates to one of the specific clairvoyances, but I don't know. I haven't seen that in any other teachings. There's a special power, supernormal power. They do call these six clairvoyances, I think they're called. One of them is the 4 magical legs, where you're able to go quickly from one place to another, but I can't seem to relate it to how it's involved in this verse. Maybe because of the clairvoyance being mentioned in the first line, that could be correlated, but there are various abilities that you can attain, as I said, but it takes great effort to do that. You can't, just profess to have them. So let's go on to the next verse, 76. The first line here once more is on the quiz. When someone tells us something beneficial, we consider him with animosity to be an enemy. When someone tricks and cheats us, we consider that heartless one to be kind. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So here our praise is kind of misplaced. We have someone who's giving us all this beneficial, wonderful advice, who really cares about us, and we treat them with animosity. We consider them to be an enemy. And the praise instead goes to someone who tricks and cheats us, who deceives us. So once more, where are we putting our loyalties? Where are we putting our praise? if others are deceiving us with their flattery or with other things that they're using, we can't see them as being kind and praise them. Instead, we have to see kindness where it's really appropriate, which is in those who are doing something beneficial for us, those who are helping us to deal with our faults, even pointing out our faults. I was talking earlier about when we're dealing with others who have faults or things that we'd like to correct in them that we feel we could be of some use, how we have to be very careful about that. But when we hear others pointing out our faults, we should be so grateful. Don't have that mind that kind of says, what are you doing talking to me about my faults? Let me tell you about your faults. Instead we have to just be very receptive to think, oh, this is a person that is actually trying to help us. And then, in the Lojong trainings in the Geshe Chikawa's verses, there's one phrase that says, of the two witnesses, trust the primary one. And that means that of the other person who is saying they see something, and of yourself who know your mind more intimately, which is the primary witness? It's yourself. And really be honestly looking at yourself and saying, is what this person telling me about myself something that is actually true, that I need to correct? And if so, be very grateful. Thank you so much. You pointed out my faults. I'm so happy you've done that for me. But if the person has given us something that isn't in accord with reality, we still respect them, but we know that we don't have to necessarily follow that advice because we've addressed that. We feel that, we don't really have that fault. Most of what they say, we probably will have that fault, though. So try to take it to heart. Don't treat others who point out our errors with disdain. Rather, really see the benefit of other people doing that for us. All right. Let's go on then to 77. We tell the confidential talk that depends on being family to enemies. When we have close friends, we unabashedly steal their hearts and minds. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So I'm going to read the way it's translated, and I think this is both, because Thupten Chodron uses Thupten Jinpa's translation. It says, when people treat me as their family, I reveal their secrets to their foes. This is a way we see that first line is that when people kind of confide in us and they have that strong closeness to us, then we reveal their secrets to their foes. We don't hold and honor that relationship that we have. Instead, we even cause them to be defeated by what they've shared with us. And when we have her translation of the second line, when people befriend me with affection, I betray their trust with no pangs of conscience. I don't have any problem betraying the trust of people, even when they've shown great affection for me. So this is about our relationships with others, see how it's important that we really honor those. I think Venerable Thupten Chodron, she talks about confiding and confiding in others. And she points out that, and this happens, I think, frequently to all of us, that somebody might come up to you and say, I'm really not supposed to tell you this because somebody confided in me, but, so, that's a warning sign that you probably shouldn't confide in them, because they're probably not somebody who trusts that confidence. I think if somebody says something to us with that caveat that they're confiding in us and it's for our ears only, that's not to be shared with anybody, no matter who that is. That is something that we need to really be respectful of. And so treat these relationships with great care, because we need to have that integrity. That can destroy relationships, right? I don't know if that's happened to anybody in the room where somebody said something to somebody that you confided in them. It's a real betrayal of friendship and trust. So uphold it. Again, I think this is good enough on that verse. Let's go on to the next one. Our annoyance is high and our conceptualizations are coarser than everyone's. We are difficult to get along with and our bad temper constantly manifests. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So our annoyance is high. We don't have much patience for others. We're always, pointing out, the things that they're doing to us and being annoyed by them and so on. We're unable to really be patient in the midst of that. Conceptualizations, this is that word namdok that I pointed out in a verse earlier. So this could be, all of our faulty thinking, our, mistaken ideas, just, are coarser than everyone else's. We have nothing to be boastful about in the least. Are very coarse and bad conceptualizations that don't accord with the Dharma, Geshe-la says. We could even call these superstitions to some degree. So we're difficult to get along with, our bad temper constantly manifests. This is all in the same vein where we just are not such a pleasant person to others, constantly annoyed, constantly creating problems, having our temper manifesting. This is obviously, not a good place to be. Why are we that way? We have to say once more, it's due to those twin demons. So we have to realize that others are, affected by how we are in the world. That's why we saw earlier that advice about always being kind of kind, gentle, compassionate, caring with others. And even if we do feel like we need to be somewhat more wrathful, we'd always hold that space of mind underneath that. But as much as possible to recognize that we do have an effect upon other people in our lives. Okay, we're at session 10, verse 79. Oh, yes, yeah. Abelardo.
Something that came to my mind. This is the kind of why it says that we should be always kind and show this kind of nice face. Sometimes that is, at least with me, is not being honest of how I'm feeling, because I tend to be like a people pleaser for many years.
Yeah.
But then, sometimes it's just very difficult. So if I'm trying to force this face, I'm not really being honest with what I feel.
Right.
Now, my intention is not to harm the other person, but if I'm putting this face, then it's not in accordance with what I'm feeling. And I don't know how the other person is going to take it anyway, so I'm always in this kind of, I might be really nice and the other person thinks,
Yeah.
what I need you.
Well, and I think we have to be kind to ourselves and recognize that we aren't always going to have this warm, sunny, smiley face everywhere we go. We've got our own problems, our own difficulties too, our own things that upset our minds. So I think it's okay to acknowledge that that's not always going to be the case, but if we don't have the intention behind it that wants others, we're not trying to, as we said earlier, rain on everyone else's parade, make everyone else feel as miserable as we are. Well, then I think it's okay. People will, certainly if somebody's going through a really difficult time in their life, speaking from personal experience, things that I've gone through, or if you're grieving, for example, it's very hard to be kind of all warm and fuzzy everywhere that you go. So that's okay, take care of yourself, but you're not doing it with any intention of making others miserable so that they kind of wallow in misery with you or something, You just do the best that you can, try to work on your own mind, try to see that it is nice if we can think of others and try to be a source of some joy and support for them, but there are times when maybe that's not in the realm of possibility, because we're just not there yet. They often use this phrase, fake it till you make it, but I don't know if faking it is always the best thing, like you're pointing out, because I think that can come off a bit, people know when you're faking it, if you're just kind of, trying to smile.
You're hurting yourself even more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is that honesty that is important. I think my own experiences as somebody who, of course, I've been teaching for a number of years, and so people do look at teachers sometimes as having greater qualities than what they possess. This is why this text is really good for me to kind of study day in and day out. I should be doing that. But to make sure that there's no kind of expectation on the part of other people that we're going to continue to show something that they might see in a teaching, whereas when I'm living my life, there are going to be times where I'm not putting on that face because that's not necessarily where my mind is at, because I've got difficulties, problems, things going on that cause me to have a different mind. So I think we do have to be attentive to that, do what we can to diminish those states in our minds. That's what our practice is all about. Is so if we wake up on the wrong side of the bed, as they say, and we know there's a cloud over our head, we're just going to be miserable for everyone else, well, maybe sit down, do some meditation on trying to change that, trying to have a different perspective. This text is all about doing that, right? Making sure that, we do what we can to address these suffering states that we have, to see that they're coming from our own self-cherishing, coming from our self-grasping. They're part of our experience of samsara. Let's change it a little bit. So again, what I was saying was that essentially, yes, all of us are going to not look pretty and perfect all the time. We're not going to always be smiley and fun to be with. But we try to do what we can to do that. And I think it is important, one thing I was going to point out in talking about myself was that I think it's important that students also see that teachers aren't perfect, that teachers are works in progress. I don't think that that's an unrealistic expectation with most teachers we have. These lamas, Lama Zopa, I don't have any doubt that he's this perfected being. But with most of our teachers that we receive teachings from, they're beings just like us. They're people that have their faults and that are doing the work, trying to do the work the ways that they can. And so it's good to see sometimes that they're not always happy, that they're not always cheerful, that they're not always kind. And then, hopefully they're apologetic at times too when they do things that might upset somebody, but, it's just the nature of beings. We're not there yet. So, is that, I don't know, maybe I'm discussing it too much, but thank you for bringing that up. It's a good point. Okay, let's go on to verse 79. When appealed to, we turn away without listening and inflict harm. When bowed to, we do not bow in return, but from a distance look for an argument. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin. To the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So when someone appeals to us, kind of comes to us for aid, we turn away from it. We don't listen. We might even inflict harm. Geshe-la points out in particular those that appeal to us to practice the dharma, such as our lamas and so on, saying you should do this and that. If you turn away from that, don't listen to them, and go off and engage in whatever else that you want to, well, that's a pretty grave thing in terms of not following the advice of our gurus. But I think whenever anybody, appeals to us, wants something from us, we should try to listen as much as we can. We may not be able to fulfill everyone's desires for us, what they're asking us to do, but don't, inflict harm on them on the basis of that. Thupten Chodron talks about how this universal excuse that goes around, certainly in Western culture, which is, I'm too busy. And she points out that, I'm just going to mention it briefly, because this current universal excuse, I think we have to really look at that. And when we say that to people, are we really being honest? Are we really too busy to give somebody the attention they need, or the time that they would want to have to explain what's going on in their life or whatever? I've been recognizing myself how I use that at times and trying to change my wording. So it's just like, I'm sorry, but I can't make time for that right now. At least be a little more honest that I'm making a decision about what I'm making time for in my life. And if you can say to somebody, I'm sorry, but what you're asking me to do isn't important enough for me to make time for in my life. That's maybe being a little more honest. But to really get clear about why it is that I'm saying to people that I can't do this or I can't do that. Obviously, we are limited in our resources. We only have so many hours in the day. But I would say there's still an awful lot of time that we could do more things in. We could do what people are asking us to do. It's just that we don't want to. We're not going along with it, for whatever reason. We might examine that more deeply, see if that's also one of these faults that's coming certainly from our self-cherishing. But be honest with people as much as we can. Don't just say, I'm too busy, and use it as our universal excuse that we can say to anybody who we don't want to spend time with or do whatever with. We just say, at least be honest, saying, I'm not making time for that in my life. I can't make time for that in my life right now. Because we do make time for a lot of other things, right? Be honest with ourselves. The second one, when bowed to, we do not bow in return. When others show us respect, when others kind of agree with us, we don't concur, we don't in return give them that respect equally. Instead we seek disputes. Instead we seek arguments. So this is again not a very good way to go about relationships with other people. Let's go on to the next one. We do not like advice, and it is always difficult for us to go along with it. We always hold tightly to the many things that offend us, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So we don't like to be given advice by others. We mentioned this earlier, right? Especially people pointing out our faults, telling us what we should be doing, what our behavior should be. And, this... we should perhaps, as I said, listen to that advice, take it into consideration, and see if there's something that we can actually learn from that, rather than not going along with it immediately, just turning ourselves away from that. Then the second one, we always hold tightly to the many things that offend us, is that even the slightest thing that causes us any pain or difficulty, we hold grudges, we get very offended by it. We hold tightly to those kinds of bad thoughts, that thought of even revenge perhaps, not forgetting it. So we have to, once more, have that understanding that we are going to be offended. We live in a world where we're just inevitably going to face somebody who doesn't like us, people who point out things in us and what have you. There's that wonderful verse in Master Shantideva, I think it's in the 6th chapter, where he's talking about patience, where he says, if we are offended by those who harm this body, we should also be offended by ourselves for having created this body. This is, we create minds and bodies that can be offended, that can be harmed. So this is our role in this whole process, So if you're offended by what people have said, you've created the mind that is offended. You've set up the target. So they're shooting the arrow at it, but you're the one who set it up in the first place. So as Geshe-la says, we need to examine our own mind, not what others are doing, not what he is doing, she is doing, and so on. This is the job only of a spy. If we receive money for spying on others, then we need to examine them, otherwise not. Otherwise we just spy on ourselves. So always with these things, if somebody's offending us, we don't try to find fault in them. We look at the ways in which we are creating our own idea of ourselves, our own view of ourselves that's causing us to be offended at that time. Let's go to 81. Our high-handedness is great, and we consider the holy to be enemies. Due to our attachment being great, we eagerly grasp at the young. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So this first part is the idea that, one way we could put this is thinking the best way to lift yourself up is to tear others down, to kind of put people down when we see them having great qualities and so on. We might have our own high-handed attitude and talk about people's faults. We don't rejoice in the qualities that they exhibit. Rejoicing is a very important practice in Buddhism, and we should always be enamored of other people's good qualities. Rejoice in them. Nothing good comes about without having created the causes. So they must have created virtuous causes in order to have good results in their lives. So we should rejoice in the fault and the things other people have, the good qualities, not talk about their faults, not be picking them apart and what have you. I think it's Master Atisha, Lama Atisha, who had in the Bodhisattva's Jewel Garland, who says something along the lines of, we should, when it comes to our own faults, we should happily reveal them. When it comes to the faults of others, we should never talk about them, that kind of idea, So, due to our attachment being great, we eagerly grasp at the young. This is generally interpreted as lust. When we have a lustful mind with great attachment, though we could say any attachment to sensory objects where we go grasping after all of those things. But here it's specifically talking about, kind of young or vulnerable people that this lustful mind goes after. But as I said, we could interpret this in any ways that attachment kind of becomes our driving force and causes us to go about trying to achieve what we want that is the object of that attachment. This is kind of a Dharma Rakshita's Me Too moment or something. Meant to be a little bit of a joke, but yeah.
Could also be things. Grasping at the young, like people going like crazy, having a surgery.
Sure. Maybe at youth, at youth, yeah.
What's the name? Where, in Brazil it's popular, lots of people dying from it.
Yeah.
You move something from somewhere, so, some parts get bigger and others smaller. Cosmetic surgery.
Yeah.
Would that be there, grasping at the
Well,
young?
I think it can be considered in the same vein as this, where we want what is pleasurable, delightful, delicious, beautiful, youthful, whatever. These are the things that attachment is always after. So, yeah, this becomes a whole mindset. And if you look at not just the fallacy of that, because you're doing things to make the appearance different, but what's underneath the surface isn't any different. The body's still that age. Everything is still, as many years as you've lived. So you're just giving an appearance. But you're spending all the time and the money and everything. So many more beneficial things could be done. Better to, put all of your effort into practice so that you have these results kind of naturally of just, things occurring in your life, and you don't get so attached to them then. They're just part of the karmic appearances. You don't have to put all that energy into changing things. It could definitely be seen in the same way. Okay? Yes, Adam.
So this might be a difficult question, or maybe you might not like the question.
We'll see.
So there's a big theme that I'm seeing here with like the hearts of the enemy being the self and the self-cherishing,
right.
Your own sense of self, and then Maraya, like killing that, and the insect eating the tree that it came out of,
right.
and the inhaling toxic electric like smoke into the heart. There's a lot of quite heavy, almost like imagery or violence towards the self. And I worry that this kind of theme could lead to I don't know, low self-esteem or even
Sure.
physical problems like heart failure or stroke or.
I understand. Yeah.
I don't know whether.
No.
I know that's obviously not the point of it. It's
Correct.
quite
Right.
opposite.
And that's why I think it is really important to do the investigation into what it is that we are throwing all that stuff at, all those negative things and all that force and violence and whatever. And it's to make sure that, and this is what we'll get into when we get to the teachings on emptiness, is to delineate, as I did a little bit already, the self that does exist, which is here in the room, and we just don't understand how that self exists. The self that we're trying to annihilate is the misconceptions of that self. A self that we hold to be most dear, most precious, a self that we hold to be inherently, truly existent. So it is a bit of precise surgery, that we have to do to remove that layer of self that is fictitious, that is the object of all of this animosity and violence, versus the self that exists that we want to uphold and have great concern for, because this is the self that becomes a Buddha. This is the self that fulfills the needs of all others. This is the self that there's no problem in kind of holding dear at that level, but we're doing it with the exact opposite state of mind. Again, we're engaging in self-centeredness that neglects the welfare of others, and a self-grasping that isn't seeing things correctly. So it is precise surgery we have to do, to make sure that we're targeting the right thing. And even when we do, that's why I find it kind of interesting that many teachers teach Tonglen as just breathing in all this horrible negative stuff into oneself, without kind of putting it on the self-cherishing mind. That's why I find this is a really useful way to meditate, is to have this mass of something quite uncomfortable that is the enemy. It's what we're trying to get rid of. It is not the self. It is the mistaken self-cherishing mind. And we have that as something in the center of our being that we place all of that stuff on. We breathe all that in, but we place it on that. We have the willingness to endure that, but the real enemy is not the self, it's the self-cherishing and the self-grasping, of course. That's, the deeper error. So I think that's a useful way to make sure we always do Tonglen, to not let it become something like I'm trying to poison myself. Well, you're not trying to poison yourself. You're not trying to kill yourself. You're trying to kill this mistaken idea of self. So that's why understanding the self that does exist and the self that doesn't exist is really quite important.
It seems like the self that does exist is actually one and the same with the other. So really, by that self, serving that self, you're actually serving the other anyway.
In a sense, because it's very subtle, and it's really just our being, that it's even the self that we could say is behind all of these actions of killing the mistaken selves. You know what I'm saying? It's like it is that genuine place of acknowledging that there is a being here, and that being wants to achieve the greatest potential that being has the ability to do, wants to be a benefit to others. So we're going to, from the point of view of that being that does exist, engage in all these activities to annihilate things that get in the way of that are these fictitious views of the self. So I agree, some people could certainly have that mistaken idea, but that's why we need to identify very clearly, and we'll get into that more this afternoon. So let's conclude for lunch. It's 12:30 on my watch, a little bit after that up there. When we come back, I'm going to maybe race through to get us to about 90-something, so I won't maybe spend quite as much time going on doing commentary, except maybe where there's like a quiz verse or something, a quiz line. And then we will try to get into these verses that start around 96. And get us into the emptiness teachings, because it's really important to spend some time on that. So let's just have a very short dedication before lunch then, as we've been doing. Just think very strongly that over these last few hours, all of the effort we put into learning this text, all the seeds we planted within our own minds, that all of this will ripen into the best possible result for both ourselves and others, the state of Buddhahood, so we can lead others to that same state. So let's say then, according to that clock, we'll start at 2:05. So you've got an hour and a half from now. Start your watches.